This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Whisper Room, and Eventide. So get ready to rock.
That's the thing about New Orleans and the way we revere our musicians is that, what car you drive or what status you have means nothing. And in New Orleans, you're ranked solely on your skill. You are judged strictly by how damn good you are on your instrument. Dr. John was a guy who had the respect of every single musician.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. If you're sick of bothering the neighbors when you are trying to record your music or ruining your recordings with outside noises, but you're not ready to spend a ton of money on permanent studio construction yet, then consider getting a Whisper Room ISO booth for your studio. Whisper Room offers the instant solution for a comfortable, quiet, ventilated, portable ISO booth with easy line of sight for recording vocals, guitar amps, or even drums. Get 10% off the 4x4 or 4x6 booth when you mention Recording Studio Rockstars. Go to whisperroom.com or click the link in the show notes below. What do Michael Brower, Joe Ciccarelli, Mike Gazowski, Dave Pensato, and George Massenburg all have in common? They all have great things to say about Eventide. Originating in a New York City basement in 1971 with the original instant phaser and H910 harmonizer, Eventide continues to transform the sound of music with the iconic H9000 harmonizer, visionary guitar effects like the H9 pedal, and now a whole suite of incredible plugins for your studio. Go to eventide.com to learn more or click the link in the show notes below. This episode is sponsored by OWC, Otherworld Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, your trusted source for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs for your studio. Let OWC focus on keeping your studio Mac in killer condition so that you can focus on making great music. Why ditch your existing Mac when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and learn how you can supercharge your studio Mac. The speed to create, the capacity to dream. Find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Chris Finney, a Grammy Winning Producer, engineer, and mixer. He is a lifelong advocate of music and business education on both the high school and college levels. His 25 plus years in the recording studio include dates with Robert Plant, B.B. King, Herbie Hancock, and New Orleans legends Dr. John, Harry Connick Jr., Alan Toussaint, The Meters, and Fats Domino. He has been instrumental in kicking off and developing the recording careers of New Orleans funk rock mainstays Galactic, Trombone Shorty, the Revivalists, Naughty Professor, and newcomers like SexualThunder and Organized Crime. In 2017, he co-founded the nonprofit 30 Amp Circuit with renowned guitarist Charlie Hunter. 30 Amp's mission is to bring music from underserved communities around the world into the mainstream. Their first project brought them to rural southeast Mexico to produce Lo Sagrado by Silvana Estrada, which was released in November 2017. Chris is currently adjunct professor of music business at Tulane University in New Orleans and is an active member of the Memphis chapter of the Recording Academy, currently serving as a chapter governor, as well as co-chair of the Producers and Engineers Wing. Also, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to Emil Luop for introducing me to Chris to bring him onto the show. Thanks, Emil. Please welcome Chris Finney to Recording Studio Rockstars. Chris, my man, are you ready to rock?
I am ready.
So is that what you guys do down in New Orleans? Do you rock, or should I have asked something different?
We rock and roll. We get our boogie on. There's no wrong way to eat a Reese's.
I like that. Are you ready to get your boogie on?
That I am.
Cool, man. Well, so give us a brief introduction to who you are in your own words. Do you still have a studio down there that you're operating out of regularly? And, how'd you get into this recording stuff?
Well, I guess how I got into it is probably best described as too stupid to stop. I've just never loved anything as much, in spite of, good financial years or bad financial years. It was like nothing gives me as much satisfaction as helping musicians complete their vision, whether it's as a producer or an engineer or a mixer, and just being around musicians. I'm a failed musician myself. And, I went in to record during high school with my high school band and realized I wanted to be on the other side of the glass more than I wanted to be playing my bass. And just kind of have always been lucky enough to follow my heart in that regard. As far as the who I am and what I do, I've kind of had a foot in every type of recording engineering that has, crossed my path. I've done broadcast audio. I've done stuff for, video for TV and movies. I've made, I couldn't even count, probably 200 or 300 records. And then countless sessions for overdubs and this and that. I've done low voltage installation for, casinos and movie theaters and stuff like that. So
yeah,
if it's audio, I've probably had a hand in it. And, but absolutely my favorite piece is making records.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. And I like that quote, too stupid to stop. We were just talking about, we were discussing the podcast sort of continuing on for, at this point, I think you're the 215th interview that I've done. But I don't know if it's too stupid of me doing the podcast. I feel like I kind of know where I'm going with this. But, I understand when it comes to music, it's just like what's one of the expressions? I'm going to totally butcher it, but it's something like, the road to success is littered with the bodies of brilliant people or something like that,
Hunter S. Thompson, the shallow money trench that's filled with, all kinds of miscreants, but it has a positive side too.
Right, exactly. Or no, but it has a negative side too. Maybe was that it? Yeah, that's it. So it's just that persistence to just enjoy making records and keep doing it that takes you through all these things. And then you talk about doing the low voltage stuff too. One of the first things I learned in the studio was how to solder and wire things. And I feel like that's a bit of a disappearing art form too for a lot of people.
It kind of is, a lot of people's experience with recording really now is ones and zeros, and you don't get that hands-on, you have a pile of gear and you have a room, let's put it together and have a studio. And the process between those 2 points really is kind of a going away, a lot of stuff is plug and play now. You can buy a pair of speakers that have amps built into the back, and all you need to do is pick up a 1/4 inch to XLR cable and you're connected to your interface. And, it's definitely the idea of the session is stopping because this microphone is not working.
We'll just buy a new mic on Amazon. It'll be here in an hour.
Basically, but think about the tube mics back in the day. Notoriously delicate, and if something happened in the middle of the session, and if it was the kind of thing you could do a quick repair, and you look, the power cable's come unsoldered. You're not shutting down the session, and you're not spending hundreds of dollars to get it fixed. So it can be a real benefit to knowing that stuff for sure.
Well, and also just wiring up a studio to begin with. That's one of those rites of passage that I feel like is such an awesome part of recording. That creation of your recording space at the very beginning, where you're figuring out how you want to run all the cables and where you want things to go and how you're going to arrange musicians and all that kind of stuff.
Totally. Making those mistakes and thinking, while you're setting it up, this is going to be great. And then actually getting in a session and going, oh, geez, what have I done?
So I did, for me, it took me a good decade and a half before I actually created a really well-built studio space, or one where it was like, I'm making some decisions, and if I screw this up, I'll be in trouble. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I think I really knew a lot more about what I needed to be able to do in the studio. So maybe there is some advice there about building a lot of temporary studios at first.
Definitely. So, helping out your friends. Anytime you find out that somebody's building a studio, Like we were talking about Emil, that's kind of how he and I grew close, was that he had a ton of questions on how to set up his studio. And it was like, you know what, let's just hang. Let me show you. Let's do this together. And that's, it's like an institutional knowledge that gets passed down. And that's how I got it. The cats who taught me are not around anymore. They're dead. I literally cannot pay them back for having taught me that stuff. So Indeed. I think it's vital that we pay it forward. And I think every one of us who's got that skill has that responsibility to share it, or else it'll go away.
Do you have a studio that you're operating out of with some regularity now?
So in 2012, I should rewind a little further than that, if you don't mind. In 2005, obviously we got wiped out by Hurricane Katrina, right. And so a lot of studios went away. The entire landscape of New Orleans music scene changed at that time, and the real hallmark studio for New Orleans for the working musicians, not the big marquee places, $1 million vintage, this and that, but the really working every day doing legitimate work studio was a place called Ultrasonic Studio. And those guys were great mentors to me and teachers as well. And after Katrina, they decided they weren't coming back. They flooded. I think they had 10 or 12 feet of water in their studio. So they decided, you know what, we've had a good run, we're getting out of it. And so I partnered up with a guy who owned a warehouse and was doing music rehearsal rooms. And he had, it was a few of them that owned the property together, and they were kind of exploring the idea of doing a recording studio. And in the aftermath of Katrina, it was like, well, wait a minute, there's a real opportunity here. If Ultrasonic's not coming back, New Orleans needs a good working studio every single day. So we threw all of our gear into a room and started soldering and built the studio called the Music Shed, which is still running to this day. I left in 2012 to become a freelance, to go back to being freelance. And so at that point, a friend of mine was running legendary studio called Studio in the Country, which is outside of New Orleans, about an hour and 15 minutes. It's in an area that we call the North Shore. It's across the lake.
I thought that was the swamp.
Yeah, it's all swamp, but you can actually drive a little bit over the.
There's more alliteration in Studio in the Swamp, but it would sound like the gear wasn't working.
You have to run the air conditioner all year round, but it's the kind of thing. Bring mosquito spray. But no, Studio in the Country is an amazing spot up on 30 acres in a place called Bogalusa, and it's got an amazing history. It was, where Kansas recorded "Carry On My Wayward Son" and "Dust in the Wind," and Cinderella recorded "Heartbreak Station" there. And I think, there's a lot of legendary kind of more regional acts like Professor Longhair and Gatemouth Brown, and that kind of stuff was done up there. A lot of the Neville Brothers early recordings, and so it had a real part to play in the New Orleans music history, and it was largely untouched by Katrina because it's about an hour and a half out of town. Yeah. And a guy I started out with, I've known for years, Ben Mumphrey, has been managing that place for about 12 years now. And so when I left in 2012, he said, "Hey man, why don't you, take whatever gear that you don't want it sitting around your house and move it up here, and I'll hook you up with a sweet trade rate where you can leave your gear here and you can book the room for, basically a fraction of the price that it would cost, if you just cold called the studio." And that's allowed me to kind of set up a workflow for my clients to where I can give them a package deal and say, we'll go do 4 or 5 days out at the studio, and then I'll bring it home to my spot where I have a room in my house that's set up as a studio. Really, it's just a control room that you happen to be able to do an overdub or two in.
Right.
But it's more about the control room, about the editing and the mixing. And then, and just recently, Ben Mumphrey from Studio in the Country and I also have partnered up with, there's an artist here in town named Alex Ebert, who had a band called Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros.
Oh yeah, I know Alex. I've recorded him.
Great guy, man. Super cool guy and super creative, just off the charts creative. And he had bought one of the great studios here in town. It was a place called Piety Street. The owners of the original Piety Street studio were they were done. They were retiring. They wanted to move on to different things. And so Alex bought the studio as a private studio and invited me and Ben to join him just in the last couple months to help. It satisfies the problem that Ben and I have of having to go an hour and a half out of the city to go get a studio. as well as it helps Alex by having two professional record makers in the building with him, using the time as well as him. So my current situation is actually pretty sweet.
That's pretty awesome, man. What a great story and what a trip. You've done all this stuff. And I was going to drop in this silly joke when you were talking about the studio in the swamp. It lends a whole new meaning to alligator clips in the studio. But that's cool. Yeah. Alex is Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros. That's one of the bands that I had in my Bonnaroo hay bale studio some years ago. And it's one of the highest views on YouTube for when we were shooting video there as well. And it was awesome. I mean, they brought in like 12 musicians and we just had to like figure out where to put everybody and how to get a condenser mic on just about everything.
That sounds like a day in the studio with him, actually.
Yeah. And then he was like, no, I don't need a mic stand. And he just held an SM7 in his hand and pointed it up towards his face and sang over it. And he was standing and dancing around, and it was all just super cool. It turned out great.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And like I said, crazy creative. He's always into something, video or politics or whatever. And it's just amazing to watch his mind work. And so when he reached out to us, it was like, of course, we want to help you have a more professional studio. Of course we do.
That's great. Well, so, hey, tell us about the photo that you sent me for this, for the podcast. It's you in an astronaut suit. What's the scoop with that?
So the very first thing I wanted to be, since I can remember, was an astronaut. My all-time hero is Neil Armstrong, and that's actually my face cropped into Neil Armstrong's official NASA Apollo photograph. But a friend of mine, when kind of in the it's coming up again every summer, third week of July, you kind of celebrate the Apollo moon mission, and that has just been something that's been integral to my life. In fact, you know how studios will put stickers on the doors, on the sliding glass doors, to keep you from walking into them when they're really clean? Ours at Studio in the Country are all NASA mission patches.
Oh, cool.
We're just space heads. And I when you had asked for a promo picture, I was like, geez, I'm normally not the guy who has his picture taken in my line of work. So let me just send him this one. And the fact that you didn't send it back and say, dude, come on.
No, I love it. I would have probably like snuck some microphones into the shot somehow too, Photoshop.
That's kind of been a part of the discussion now too, is like, how do we incorporate some microphones into this picture?
Well, we'll just do a crowdsource right now. Rock stars, if you're into that kind of thing, download Chris's photo off the website, add some cool recording gear, and send it back to me, and I'll make sure Chris gets it, and we'll send you a big thank you and a shout out.
That's outstanding.
Awesome. Well, cool. So your studio sounds awesome now, and I guess it's brand new, so you're sort of getting settled in. Do you want to talk about any particular recent projects that you're working on, stuff that's happening right now? And I definitely want to get into next talking about your nonprofit with Charlie Hunter. What a cool story that must be. That's
been a fun experience. But yeah, as far as recently, I've been teaching the past couple of years at Tulane University in town, which is a fantastic university, and they just have never really had a music business department or anything to augment the music part of their curriculum. And they caught wind of my programs that I do for nonprofits for high school kids, specifically the Trombone Shorty Foundation and stuff. And it's everything from personal finance to how to set up and run a business, how to treat your band like a business, how to treat your band like a brand. And then, we'll get into the production kind of thing, and I'll teach them how to make a recording on their phone. They think it's so daunting to get into recording, and then I make them realize you've got the tools in your pocket right now, and putting that stuff together has been a really cool adventure for the high school kids. Well, Tulane University caught wind of it, and they said, hey, do you think you could teach this at a college level? And I was like, sure. For a guy who's never been to college, I'll give it my try. Nice. And so they loved it, and it's been successful now for I think I'm going on my 5th year doing that. So in a lot of ways, I've not been fighting the have to make a record every single day fight like I once was. And the other piece of it is that I get to kind of get the front row seat on the up and coming musicians that are coming through town. And starting off their career from college. The cats who are smart enough to know, hey, I want to take music seriously and I don't want to get lost in the wash in a place like LA or New York or Nashville. I want to make a name for myself starting from the art, and New Orleans is a great place to do that. So if you have the opportunity to come down to Tulane, you get that world-class education as well as kind of this immersion in the artistic side of things. And so I've been working with a lot of younger students who are coming up. The Revivalists were one of those bands, and a band called SexualThunder, and a band called Organized Crime has now broken off and started another band called Boogie Trio, which is really tearing it up on the festival circuit right now. And so my father had an interesting observation over the holidays, which was like the football coach who's got a couple of Super Bowl rings, but has gone back to coaching high school because the football is more pure.
Right.
I think that's an apt analogy for where I'm at right now, is that I still work with my big dogs, when they call, but I'm more excited right now about finding new talent and finding the up and coming cats who are ready to launch themselves out into the stratosphere.
Yeah. Well, these are the soon to be big dogs.
That's it.
And you've certainly worked with some great people. I mean, you've got credits with Robert Plant, Dr. John, Charlie Hunter. I saw him come play here. He played at a local club, and I was so excited when I heard that, and I went and bought a ticket, and I was just completely knocked out. What a trip. It was just him and a drummer here.
Yeah.
And he was such a character because he was dressed like he was just come straight from a construction site or something like that. And he looked very imposing. He looked like he would just kick your ass and then plays all this incredible guitar stuff. Tell us about starting 30 amp circuit with him. What's that all about?
So I've known Charlie for more than 20 years. He and I made a record together with the drummer for Galactic. Is a brilliant guy named Stanton Moore. And we did Stanton's first solo record together.
Was that all cooked out?
All cooked out. Yeah. The producer
great record.
Dan Prothero. Thanks, man. Yeah. Dan Prothero really had the vision for that, and was like, he kind of had this idea that it was going to be like a classic Blue Note kind of vibe, all the way down to the album cover. And I can't say enough about Dan and his talents as a producer, which would then lead me to talk about the musicians that were involved. And it was cats like Skerrick and Charlie and, a handful of local New Orleans cats. But the core band was Stanton on drums, Charlie on bass and guitar, and then Skerrick on saxophone. And we kind of augmented it from there. And Charlie and I really hit it off, realized we kind of saw things the same way, and just kept in touch and worked together over the years. I produced a record for him in 2005 called Copperopolis. And that was his trio. And we just went into the studio and spent a week having a blast. We did the pre-production in a live concert during Jazz Fest, and it was just, everything clicked. And so we realized we have this kind of interesting similarity to our perspective about music and creation. And that's about where the similarities end, because that dude is an alien. Like, he is so insanely talented.
Charlie is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
His mind is like nobody I've ever met. And I've met some weirdos. Describe to the rock stars what's different about his guitar. It's not like everybody else's guitar. No, it is not. He plays an 8-string, sometimes 7-string guitar. That's basically the 3 lowest strings of a bass guitar, and then the 5 to 6 highest strings of an electric guitar. And so he's had various instruments through the years, and you'd have to pick his brain to find out exactly the mechanics of what he's doing. But basically, the lowest string on the instrument is as thick as an E string on a bass guitar, and the highest string is, a B or an E on a regular guitar. And he plays both instruments at once. It's amazing to watch him do it. He's playing perfectly formed, perfectly articulated bass lines while comping and soloing on the single instrument. It's really, really something to see.
Is this one of those things where his right hand comes over and he's playing the chords with his right hand too, or is all the fretting happening with his left hand?
It's all fretted on his left hand. He is voicing each chord to include the bass line that he wants to play. He plays the bass line basically with his thumb. So think of like a finger-picking guitar style where the thumb is playing the bass notes and then your top 3 or 4 fingers are doing the pluck either for an accompaniment or for a lead line. He uses a lot of hammer-ons and stuff like that when he's soloing. But just ridiculously funky bass lines happening on top of this great, tasty guitar stuff. Like he can imitate the whole rhythm section from James Brown. It's ridiculous to see him play. You really have to kind of see it to believe it.
That's a trip, man.
You know, he's like I said, some of the most tasty and funky bass lines. Like he's all over D'Angelo's. I think he's on that song Spanish Joint all over the Voodoo record, and it's like just insane how funky his playing is. And then when you realize that's not 2 dudes, that's 1 dude playing both instruments.
Now, do you know if he's sort of splitting out the bass strings to a bass amp and the guitar to a guitar amp, or is it all 1 amp? Any thoughts about that stuff?
He does, yeah. And when he and I have recorded together, that's exactly what we'll do is we split it out. I'll take a DI on the bass strings. He's got, like I said, over the years, he's got a million different configurations, and I can talk about the last one I recorded.
Sure.
And the next one might be completely different. But as far as the last time I recorded it was pickups that were aligned with the bass strings that gave you predominantly the bass signal. And I'd take a DI and a mic on that. And then in the mix, we ended up throwing away the DI because the mic just sounded great. And then on the high strings, he runs them. There's a separate set of pickups. At one time he was using Bartolini's or whatever. Like I said, he's always onto something new, like Eddie Van Halen, just constantly remaking his equipment.
Right.
And but the top strings will go through a pedal board and then into a guitar amp, usually some kind of Mesa Boogie. A big part of his sound can include like a Leslie sound, like a vibrato tremolo kind of vibe, almost like a fake Leslie or a what was the one that looked like a wah pedal, but it's on the tip.
Like a Univibe or something.
Yeah,
like
like
that,
a Univibe, exactly. And so he'll incorporate that in as a way to kind of give the guitar texture to another dimension. And I've rarely he uses distortion, but I've recorded him doing some distortion before.
Nice. And then what about some of your miking techniques for these amps? Anything you want to share about that?
Something that's interesting and I think valuable to the rock stars to hear about would be he's the one who really turned me onto this idea of using an ISO box, which he had one custom built, and it's basically a 10-inch bass speaker built into a cabinet that then has airspace above it. So think of a guitar cabinet in a box. Mm-hmm. So that you can put the speaker has its own space and airspace, and then the microphone has its own airspace, and you can close the whole thing off, and it's somewhat isolated from the rest of the room. And one of the cool things, he was always frustrated with the way the bass sounds in the headphones. And so what we did is we started taking the ISO box, and he would sit on it.
So nice.
He's now feeling the bass, tactile. Through a tactile mode, and then hearing whatever articulation he needs in the headphones, and that's really kind of a game changer. And it's something that I've used over the years because so much of what we do now involves home recording. It gives you an opportunity to record at home if you don't have a proper isolation space.
Yeah, I recorded Michael Rhodes here, who's one of the A-list session guys in Nashville, bass player, played on many, many master albums. And he brought in to the session, this was like more than 20 years ago. No, it was probably about 20 years ago when I did the session. But he brought in a similar thing where it was like a little rolling seat, and the bass speaker was facing upwards, and the mic was above it, and then the seat closed on top of that, and he was just sitting on this thing, and so it was totally isolated, and he could feel his bass, and there was no, like you said, no headphone issues. I love stuff like that. I love like really thinking outside the box, and
it really is. Yeah, it's a creative way to solve a problem, and the simpler you can come up with those solutions, usually the better, and the more transferable they are, and that's a technique I've used in the most embarrassing and humble closet studio to, $1 million large format studios. That same technique works wherever you are.
Now, when you say you've used that technique, have you created one that belongs to you that you can take to different sessions, or you've used it with Charlie using his?
I did, and I lost it over the years. Some guitar player got his hands on it and said, "Oh man, this thing sounds great. Why don't you just leave it here at my house?" And I kind of lost track of it. But that or just the idea of using a box to isolate a guitar amp in the room with you, whether it's bass or guitar, that's something that's super useful. And I was at Sam Phillips recording with my friend Matt Ross Spang.
Yeah,
and
he's awesome.
got a wall of these. It's like a sofa almost, and you flip open the seat part of the sofa, and there's room for an amp and a microphone. And I realized these guys were onto this in 1962.
That's a trip.
Super useful way to do it. And I definitely am considering, if I make any upgrades to the studio here at the house, I probably would do something like that, build another one of those boxes, whether it's portable or not. But I think that's just a super useful thing to have. I've seen some companies who've made them. I think Carvin made one for a while, but nothing's going to be as cool as making it yourself, or getting with a friend who's a carpenter. We all started off building speaker boxes for cars in our in our early days, so
right.
It's not far off from that.
All right. Well, I hate to say it, but you're not going to get off that easy, man. So now I got to ask you, how can you describe on the podcast how you would build a box like that? So, because you're going to have a lot of people intrigued who want to go off and try it right now. Give us some tips.
I'll get with my friend Rick, who actually drew it up, and I'll send it to you so that you can post it on the website for sure.
All right, I'll do it. This means, of course, that I'll get in trouble for having forgotten when this goes out, and then somebody will remind me, and then I'll hustle and get it done.
Get plans from Rick. But no, basically, you'd start off by building a guitar cabinet, and then build a box that's big enough to hold that guitar cabinet in it. And then you cut a door into that box that's big enough to fit a microphone stand to. They get complicated. You can put XLRs on the outside and seal them up with rubber weather stripping and stuff like that. There's tons of plans on the internet.
What goes on the inside? Do you sort of have to line it with something soft and fuzzy?
Yeah, I've had good experience with that. The classic Owen Corning 705 stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You line it with that, and if you're lazy, you'll deal with fiberglass shards for the rest of the life of that box. But if you're not lazy, you can cover it with cloth and make it nice. But it's definitely better to dampen the inside so that you kind of just have that relationship between the microphone and the speaker and nothing else.
And then the box just closes on top as a lid. You could almost drop a combo down into the box.
That's it. Yeah, I've seen a handful of those as well, where you take a combo amp and just drop it inside, and then there's a latch, like a sessions latch on it that'll seal the lid shut. The other ones are I've seen somebody do it with a drum case, like the case from a kick drum, big 24-inch kick drum case. You put the amp in it, line it with blankets, throw a microphone in there, throw the top on it, and get moving.
Ooh, that's clever. And then you just need a little hole on the side, or you could put an XLR jack directly on it and have a mic on a stand ready to go inside or something like that.
Yep.
And then have you discovered that, so you want it to be pretty thick wood though, right? So it's
MDF,
blocking sound.
3/4 or 5/8 inch thick MDF, the real dense fiberboard. It's not the kind of stuff you want to get wet. But the thicker the better, and it gets to be pretty heavy, so they tend to be small, as small as you can afford to make them. The one that Charlie and I use for his bass, it's a 10-inch speaker inside of it, and the speaker's pointing straight up. So The whole thing, I think you're probably, when you sit on it, it's basically as high as a chair, so about 20-something inches, 26 inches maybe, and half of the volume of the empty space is for the speaker cabinet, and the other half of the volume is where you put the microphone.
Cool. That's a great description. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
And I think in the speaker cabinet, same thing. Now, inside the speaker cabinet, like the inside of my NS10 speakers, that's where it's safe to just have a whole bunch of the pink fluffy insulation.
Totally. Right? You can geek out on it. There's different. They used to call it Q and stuff like that, but like the resistance that the speaker needs and the volume of the airspace, you can kind of cheat the amount of volume and resistance by putting more insulation on the inside. But yeah, in my general experience, it's just stuff it with acoustic material, whatever, fiberglass, or there's that stuff that looks like the air conditioning filter, just anything you can do to deaden that inside of that box behind the speaker tends to work better.
Yeah. And that reminds me of some of the acoustical physics. I remember learning that, if you took a buzzer and it was sitting on a tabletop and then you put a box over it, it quiets down the volume of that buzzer. But if you put insulation inside the box and put the box over the buzzer, it quiets it down like a ton more.
That's exactly it. Yeah. It's all about acoustic impedance. You're taking sound from an area where there's a lot of volume and you're moving it towards a sound where there isn't the ability to have a lot of volume, and it tends to dissipate that energy really quickly. The same way light bends when it goes into an aquarium. You stick a stick into an aquarium and it looks like the light is bending. Mm-hmm. Acoustically, the same thing happens when you go from an acoustically active space to an acoustically neutral space, is that the sound basically is bending rapidly. And so the more absorption you have, the more rapidly you bend the sound towards silence.
Ooh, sound benders.
Right?
How was it that? I think I used to have a good distortion pedal called the sound bender, didn't I? Oh no, maybe that was one of those EQ booster pedals.
The tone bender.
The tone bender. There you go. Recording Studio Rockstars Academy is the place you can go to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level. And you can start right now with my free introduction to mixing course, Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. And the best part is that these mixing techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you are in Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One, Reaper, or anything else. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to Mix Master Bundle to get started for free now, or look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Cool, man. All right. Well, so let's see. Let's talk more about, recording with Stanton Moore and Charlie and stuff like that. How would you record Stanton's drums on a record like that?
On that particular record, a lot of it, again, came from Dan Prothero, who was producing it. And Dan is a really able engineer as well. But he was totally, bear in mind, this was 1997, 98. So you didn't have the internet where you could just toss out an idea like the Glyn Johns 3 microphone technique.
Right.
And it couldn't iterate over and over again through a whole bunch of studio experiences because somebody read about it on the internet. It was in those days, information about those advanced technology tricks, recording technology tricks were
you had to be there.
Yeah, you had to be there. They had to be passed down anecdotally, or you had to scour tons and tons of magazines, Sound on Sound, and the early days of Tape Op when it was just a folded up piece of paper, and Mix magazine, and even Guitar Player magazine. I remember scouring Guitar Player magazines to just find any gem that Jimmy Page would drop, because that dude basically wrote the book on modern rock and roll recording. It's like, you could talk about the Tom Dowds and the Bill Putnams, but really when it comes down to it, what Jimmy Page did for heavy and hard rock recording it can't be measured, man. That dude really wrote the book.
Nice. I've also heard that he's incredibly close to the vest about his guitar techniques and stuff like that now from somebody else. So maybe he used to share more and maybe now he doesn't, or I don't know. Maybe I got it all wrong.
Or even it was, like I said, it was the kind of thing that you'd have to dig through issues and issues of Guitar Player magazine in hopes that he would talk about what microphone he used for whatever, And so back then it was hard fought to get this information. And so Dan was real into this idea of doing the 3 microphone thing. And the one microphone that we had 3 tube condenser microphones, one of my favorite microphones of all time, and our studio at the time just happened to have 3, was the Sony C37A.
Oh, it's a great mic, yeah.
It's basically the poor man's U47. Like it's as close as I've come to a 47 that's not a 47 or trying to be.
It's a little bit smaller diaphragm too, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is, and it's it was basically Sony's late 60s answer to the big classic German microphones that were all over the place. Mm-hmm. And it has a sound that's all of its own. It's really an incredible microphone in and of itself. But when you start to think of it in context of like a Neumann, the only thing that can really compete is a classic U47. And so in that sense, it was a great microphone for us. And, when we were first starting out, Daniel Lanois had Kingsway Studio in town. And so we would try to hang by the back door and learn whatever secrets blew out of the window from that place. And
I'm glad you brought up Daniel. I wanted to ask about that. When I was interning at Woodland Studios, he came up there to work with Emmylou Harris.
Yep.
And he had his studio down in New Orleans, and he was just super cool to meet. And I knew some people who went down there, and I was very intrigued by it. I saw pictures of it. It was like this Kingsway, right?
Yep, that was the spot. Yeah,
yeah. It was like old, funky, cool looking rooms in an old mansion.
It was this old mansion on Esplanade Avenue, and it's probably a 10,000 square foot mansion, so you had plenty of space.
Yeah,
and the acoustic spaces were amazing, and it wasn't a proper studio by any stretch, but it had such a vibe, REM and U2 and and it's just, the list goes on and on of people who he recorded there. But one of them, it's interesting too that you mentioned Emmylou Harris, but her Wrecking Ball album, the vocal sound on that is a Sony C37, and that has been that record was one of the reasons we were all sideways about that microphone. It was like, how that vocal, oh my God. So that the C37 definitely came to our group through the fact that Lanois was here in town, and Malcolm Byrne and Mark Howard and Mike Napolitano and Trina Shoemaker. All those guys were our teachers because we were trying to be like them.
I know Nappy.
Yeah, Nappy is, I can't say enough about that dude, man. He's given us all so much in the creative recording community down here. That's a special dude too, man.
Cool, man. All right, so tell us what you remember about using those three C37s on the drums to kind of get that Glyn John sound.
So it was the best way, and I'm going to encourage everybody who hears this to experiment, try it. Go and screw it up so that when you get it right, you remember. And you remember all the way down to your bones, because it starts off, you pick a spot. Basically, I choose the lug closest to the drummer's kick drum knee. So the lug on the snare that's closest to the kick drum kind of creates this galactic central point for the drum kit. So you start from that spot, meaning that all the sounds of the drum kit are closest to that spot, basically.
Right.
So if you start from that spot, usually on the snare, and you measure up 2.5 drumstick heights, then you put the first microphone right there, directly overhead, like a mono overhead mic, 2.5 drumstick heights above. So then the next one is going to be 2.5 drumstick lengths from the same spot on the snare, except drawing a line through the floor tom. And that's where you put the second mic. So then the third mic, which I think is actually the most important, is 2.5 drumstick lengths straight out in a line that goes in front of the kick drum. So straight out through the kick drum in front of the kit. So it's almost as if you were miking the kit with one microphone from the front, and then again, one microphone from the overhead. And then you have this weird one microphone thrown off to the side by the floor tom.
Now the one over by the floor tom, how high up or down do you think it needs to be?
So in my experience, the best distance and height is basically to where you're drawing a line that you can see both heads of the floor tom and the snare if your eyeball was the microphone diaphragm. So you don't want to go so low that you're below the rim, but you don't want to go so high that you're starting to get up in cymbal world. So you just kind of want it to look right over the head of the floor tom so it's about at the height of the top of the floor tom.
And it's potentially catching the underside of the crash and the ride cymbal and stuff like that. So it's almost like the overhead mic and the floor tom mic are seeing both sides of the cymbals.
Yeah, exactly. And from two different distances. So it starts to bring up, and like I said, since it's been on my radar for so long. It's not always a practical mic technique to use. And I have to give that caveat, because especially if you're in a session in a big studio and your client's relying on a specific sound, you're not going to get like a Dream Theater or a metallic.
No Dave Weckl drums that way.
It's not going to happen, But that said, it teaches you some important lessons that I think are worth talking about. And the first is that you can think of microphones as having a focal length, the same way that a lens on a camera would. And so the same way you would mess with depth of field on a camera, where how much of the image is in focus, choosing which microphone can really determine how much of that image is in focus, if you will, to borrow the analogy even further. So that floor tom mic in the Glyn Johns setup, it's got the floor tom front and center, but the snare, the whole thing is being 2.5 drumstick lengths away from the snare, means that every microphone is equidistant from the snare. So each microphone is going to have the snare in the same focus. And I think that's a big part of how that sound comes together when you put all three. And then you can pan the overhead a little bit to the left, and you pan the floor tom way off to the right. And you kind of can fake a stereo sound out of it, which is how Zeppelin did it. But I like doing all three, keeping them in mono, and then doing room mics to create the stereo. That's another useful way of doing it. Mm-hmm. And it becomes super critical to make sure the drums sound like you want them to sound. And that, to take it back to the Stanton Moore record, it was Dan's idea to do the Glyn Johns mic technique, but it wouldn't have worked if Stanton's drums weren't jaw-droppingly amazing sounding to begin with, and he wasn't such a great player. So bear that in mind as you use it,
Well, it's totally true. When you experiment with these three mic techniques, that's one of the first things I discovered. I remember trying to add in like a kick mic, right, where it might normally go, and I'm like, why does that kill the whole thing that I had going?
Yep.
And then I was like, well, why don't I just try and have that the same distance as these other mics, so that when that beater of the kick hits, it's being heard at the same time in all three mics. And all of a sudden everything just came into focus, and it was pretty cool.
It really is a great analogy to use thinking about it in focus, because you're taking it from multiple perspectives. And that's where we borrow a page from Hollywood. You don't have to, I don't have to record this exactly like you think it was recorded. But if I can convince you it was recorded this way, then it doesn't matter how I actually recorded it. So if you're trying to get a real pristine, pure, verite, I was there kind of sound, you can use 10 microphones to do that. As long as they come together in a way that convinces the listener, I'm hearing this pure, he must have only used 2 microphones and a bloom line or something like that. Whatever it takes in the end. But if you start messing with the phase of things and the time of things, like I said, it's a great technique to experiment with, because it's hard and you can make mistakes doing it quickly. And those mistakes are what make you good fast.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that tip. That's a great one. We're going to take a break now for just a second. We'll come back in for the jam session, and stick around, Rockstars, because I'm going to dig into questions about things like how in the world you record the Rebirth brass band and working with Dr. John and B.B. King and others. A reminder, Rockstars, that you'll find links to what we're talking about in the show notes. And hopefully, if Chris and I have our act together, we'll have that guitar box ready for you, so you can check it out there too, the design ideas. And if you're on your mobile device, just click through, and the link should be right there, so you can check it all out. And of course, there's a playlist of YouTube videos, so you can go hear a bunch of Chris's awesome work. We'll see you guys in just a minute for the jam session. It was 1971 in a New York City basement when Eventide revolutionized the audio world by introducing the world's first studio effects processor, the Instant Phaser, and the first digital effect, the H910 Harmonizer. Eventide soon followed with the Instant Flanger, Omnipressor, SP2016 Reverb, and H949 and H3000 Harmonizers, which have been favorites of A-list mixers like Michael Brower, Joe Ciccarelli, Mick Guzowski, and Dave Pensato, and heard on countless hit records over the decades. Today, Eventide brings all that sound to your stage and studio with modern solutions like the H9000 Harmonizer, their complete line of guitar pedals, including the versatile H9 Max, and transformative plugins like Micropitch, Physion, Black Hole, and Mangled Reverb. Take your next mix in your studio to a whole new level. Go to eventide.com or click the link in the show notes below. Are you sick of bothering family and neighbors when you're just trying to rehearse or record your music? Do outside noises or computer fans get into your studio mics and ruin your recordings? You could book a pro studio to record every time, but that would add up quickly, and doing permanent construction to soundproof your studio can easily cost up to $100,000 or more. Trust me, I know. And you can't take that with you when you eventually move the studio. Don't you wish there was an easy solution right now? Whisper Room ISO Booths offers a simple way to install a comfortable, quiet, ventilated ISO booth in your studio with easy line of sight for recording vocals, guitar amps, or even drums in a variety of sizes. For 30 years, Whisper Room has been solving studio isolation needs worldwide with ISO booths that are shippable, portable, and can be assembled in an afternoon. Now you can get pro vocal recordings right in your home studio, practice whenever you want, and start using real guitar amps again. Get 10% off the 4x4 or 4x6 booths when you mention Recording Studio Rockstars at whisperroom.com or click the link in the show notes below. Are you using a Mac in your recording studio? Are you tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly? Wouldn't it feel great to have a trusted friend to help you keep your existing Mac and studio setup current and relevant so that you can focus on the thing you love most, which is making great music? Well, now you can rely on OWC, Otherworld Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, whose mission it is to help you get the most mileage out of your Mac. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac that's ready to rock, OWC will help take your studio far into the future with a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49. Why get frustrated and ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Chris Finney, joining us from Nolens, and we're talking about making great records down there, working on the groove and the boogie. You ready to boogie, man?
I'm ready to boogie. Let's get it on.
All right, cool. So let's see. The other instrument I wanted to ask you about, because you had mentioned working with Stanton Moore and doing drums and Charlie Hunter on guitar and sax. Talk a little bit about how you have discovered a great way to record saxophone.
It really is kind of one of my favorite things to record. So you have to start by loving it, which means that you have to learn what you hate about the saxophone before you learn what you love about the saxophone. And I'm not a big fan of the soprano or the alto sound, so I always struggled with how do I get these soprano and alto sounds to sound appealing and exciting for me. And so It was like ribbon mics, always ribbon mics. The Coles 4038 is one of those microphones that are going to pry out of my dead hands. I'm never getting rid of them. I have 4 of them, and I will never, ever get rid of them. It's one of the most versatile and useful ribbon microphones of all time. And so I started looking at that stuff, and like we were saying earlier about trying to find whatever piece of information you could before the internet existed, I remember seeing a picture of John Coltrane recording with a RCA 44 and a Neumann U47 put right together. And I remember thinking, okay, this is a good place to start. And of course, it's 2 of the rarest and most desirable microphones on the planet.
Of course.
But you put those 2 together and you're going to nail the saxophone sound pretty much. Whatever that player is giving you, you're going to get it. So for me, it started with how do I tame the shrillness of an alto or a soprano and make it sound as beautiful in the ensemble as the baries and the tenors do to my ear. And it came out of that ribbon microphone kind of effort, where a ribbon microphone is a little bit more lazy of a microphone. It's not as prompt about how it reproduces high frequencies. It's a little bit, whatever, we'll get to that. 10K, yeah, cool, whatever. And so the darkness, the apparent darkness of a ribbon microphone really can complement the overly brightness of a saxophone. Those harmonics that come off of a saxophone can be pretty shrill. And I find that using a ribbon microphone, whether it's the only microphone or one of a couple of microphones, I think a ribbon is a key piece to recording brass in general, but saxophone in specific.
It's got me thinking about some of the experiments when we're recording drums, when we're recording even acoustic guitar. So for example, acoustic guitar, you always see the mic out by the 12th fret kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that seems pretty standard and it sounds pretty great. But then occasionally you experiment with something like, well, what does it sound like to the guitar player? What if I just put a mic up where the guitar player's ear is looking down? What does that sound like? And you can discover that sounds pretty amazing too. Have you ever explored saxophone actually from the perspective of the player's ear?
Okay, so this is a crazy story. I've worked with Harry Connick Jr. on and off for a lot of years. His producer is a very close friend of mine, a guy named Tracy Freeman, and Harry and Tracy went to high school together. So that's how long and tight their connection is. So I've gotten an opportunity to help Tracy pull off a lot of things over the years for Harry that Harry just, as an artist, goes, oh yeah, just do that. And we, as the production team, have to go, how the shit do we do that? Or how do how do we pull this off? Probably like George Martin felt when John Lennon said, I want you to tie me up and spin me around the microphone. It's like, how, what? So one time we got we were doing a great performances for PBS, and it was recorded by David Hewitt up in New York at the Nederlander Theater and on Broadway. I think Ryan, his son, was assisting him before Ryan Hewitt was one of the hottest.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Both those guys have been on my podcast too.
Oh, man, awesome guys both. And, I like to give Ryan a hard time because he's having a hell of a career right now. Yeah. But the recordings were impeccable, but it was something like 150 channels or 164 channels or something like that. And so it's going to be a big band, and there's some, more creative mic techniques like zone, if you want to think of it as zone defense versus man to man. There's some microphones that are covering a whole section of people, but then there were some microphones that were close mics, and they ended up being really redundant. And the majority of those were clip-on microphones that, number one, allowed Harry to communicate with the band off, basically off camera, or when they weren't performing, he could call the next song or make adjustments in between, and it didn't go out into the house on the PA. It was only something that was recorded because, as an abundance of caution, I guess. And so there was one saxophone piece where he was on a lavalier clip-on type microphone to do his solo because he's walking out into the crowd. It may have been a trombone. Don't get me to lying on exactly what instrument it was. But they walked out on stage to play the instrument, and the lavalier mic was failing. And so it was like you had less than ideal sound all the way through. Now, they fixed it really quickly. But in that moment, that was the moment that we had to make advantage of. It was that I think the sax performance overlapped Harry's introduction of the player. So you couldn't separate the two. We were forced to use this audio that was not great in this one particular moment. And we realized, holy crap, Harry's got a clip-on mic, and the trombone player or whoever it was, a sax player, had a clip-on mic. Let's listen to what the clip-on mic sounded like.
Now, this is up near the lapel, like if you were shooting a video and you'd clip it up on your...
Exactly right. It was not meant to be an instrument microphone at all. It was meant to be a microphone so that the musicians could communicate verbally outside of the microphones that were recording their instruments.
Okay, dig it.
The kind of the way you do with in-ear monitors now. You'll have a microphone that only speaks to people on the in-ear, and the crowd doesn't hear you saying, hey, drummer, tighten up, or whatever. So it was that kind of system. And what we realized was the good microphone, I'm making quote fingers as I say that, the good microphone was screwing up. But we had these lavalier microphones on everybody, and we were able to actually construct part of the performance for this saxophone, I think it was, from the microphone that was clipped on his lapel for his communication stuff. And it was a really neat sound. Unfortunately, we couldn't explore it further because we had the rest of the concert already mixed, and it was like in surround sound, and it was a really complicated mix. Like I said, 160 something channels. But it kind of was a thing in the back of our head. Hey, we should explore that at some point, and we obviously never have. But the idea that putting a clip-on microphone as the musician is going to hear it might give you a different perspective that you weren't anticipating.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I know it works great on acoustic, and a lot of times, that mono overhead on a drum can end up coming down really close. So it's almost about the same height as the drummer's head,
Totally. Yeah. That Charlie Hunter record, Copperopolis, is the Charlie Hunter trio. The drummer was Derek Phillips, if I'm not mistaken. And we put a Neumann U47 right next to his right ear. And then I think I just had a kick and snare mic in addition to that. And the main drum sound on that recording is this Neumann right next to Derek's head.
Oh, that's great, man. That's super cool. All right. Well, let's talk about some other stuff. Let's keep going on brass. You've recorded the Rebirth brass band. I mean, that is just massive. Talk a bit about how let's say I got the call and it was like, hey man, you got to come record this brass band. And I have actually done that at Bonnaroo. And it was fun, but I mean, we just had to put close mics on everything and sort of figure it out. But if you were hitting the studio, like, what should the rock stars know about how to approach a really big section like that? And here's an important question for you as a New Orleanser. What do you guys call yourselves down there? New Orleansers? Little Indians?
New Orleanians.
New Orleanians, sorry. New Orleanians, great. How do we record tuba?
Well, you have to get creative. I'll start with the tuba and then talk about how to record the rest of the band. But the tuba, again, going back to this idea of recording in multiple perspectives at once. Just think about when you mic a drum kit. You got an inside kick drum mic. You might have an outside kick drum mic. But when you blend them, you can't really tell. We as engineers can take it apart and say, oh, that's an inside mic blended with an outside mic. But the average listener just hears kick drum. And so the same thing happens with the whole entire kit. You got your overheads, which are picking up the whole entire kit, but then you've got a microphone on the snare. And sometimes that has utility in the sense that I can turn the snare up independently of everything else. But if you get the mix part of it just right from that original blend of microphones, in essence, what you're doing is you're recording the drum kit from multiple perspectives. And when you blend those perspectives, your ear hears all of the perspectives at once, kind of like parallel compression. You're hearing the compression and the clean signal at the same time. Your ear doesn't bother to take it apart and go, oh, he's using parallel compression. Your ear just says, wow, that sounds cool.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the tricks to recording brass in general is to try to get it from multiple perspectives. So on the tuba, or the sousaphone technically, you got to get that low fundamental because it's the bass. It's the whole bottom of the song. You have to have this nice fat low end to tell the story. And then the next piece of it is the articulation of it is an actual brass instrument. So you want to be able to hear those brass overtones. And then the third perspective is the shout part of it, the fact that every sound you hear from a tuba or a sousaphone is coming out of this giant bell that's like almost 3 feet across. It's like putting your hands next to your mouth when you yell. It really magnifies the sound. So ideally, to record the tuba, you take a 58, SM58, and you wrap it in a towel and you put some rubber bands around it so that it doesn't clank around when you drop it down the throat of the tuba.
Wow.
And there's a spot on the tuba where the horn connects to the body of the tuba. So that think about if you guys are going to have to look it up and see, but if you're dismantling a tuba to travel with it, you unscrew these 3 set screws at the throat of the horn where the horn becomes the bell. And the bell will separate into 2 separate pieces. You can stack them, put them in a case, and hop on an airplane. But when the horn is assembled, that seam where those set screws are becomes the perfect place for your microphone to end up. So when a tuba is playing in a rock setting, in a rock club, like at Tipitina's here in New Orleans or whatever, the sound guys usually just will throw, sound guys and gals, to be clear. We have some amazing female recording engineers and live engineers in this city. It has to be represented. But what they do is they'll just drop this 50. I've seen it work with a 57, a 58, a Beta 52, a D112, anything that you would use on a kick drum or a bass. You can throw down the throat of that horn, and you're not going to get a lot of. It's just super clean low end. You get each note from its lowest note, but it's not, an audiophile recording of the horn. But it really works if you're going to put the horn through a bass amp like Matt Perrine or a PA system like Kirk Joseph. You've really got. And so we borrowed a couple of those ideas in doing Rebirth, because a lot of this music is meant to work on the street first. So there, you kind of have to start from that distant perspective. The only the brass band players and the people marching in the parade are going to hear the horns and the drums with their head basically inside the instrument. The rest of us hear it from 20, 30 feet away. And I think growing up here, I can remember begging our folks, my brother and sisters and I, begging our folks to take us under the bridge where the overpass was, so that we could hear the bands as they marched under the bridge, because the sound was so intense underneath the bridge.
That's great, man.
And so you want to kind of think in that sense of perspective. So you start with the microphone down inside a 58 wrapped in a towel so it doesn't clink inside the horn, and then you can take the cable and wrap it around the mouthpiece to keep the mic from going deeper in it. And it really doesn't disturb how the player interacts with the horn. And I think that's a key piece to mention, is that no matter what we do in the studio, the last thing we want to do is change the way a musician behaves or has to sit, or you never want to make a musician uncomfortable for the way it sounds. Now, if the musician wants to get uncomfortable to make it sound better, that's on them. But I'm less inclined to ask a musician to be uncomfortable for my microphone,
Yeah, and a quick reminder, a lot of times if you work with musicians that are maybe new territory in the studio for them, they're not going to know what comfortable is just yet. They'll just look at your mic and they'll automatically do something awkward because they think they're supposed to.
Yeah,
and so you have to really watch out for that.
Yeah, somebody who's inexperienced, they'll grab a ribbon microphone and scream into it because they don't realize this is just for the horn at 5 feet away. This is not for the screaming voice at 1 inch away.
Yeah.
But yeah, so to continue with the tuba, the next place you're going to have that match of nice, rich low end with the beautiful articulation and overtones that brass can give you is right there at the edge of the bell. So we invented this piece. There was a sound guy named Brent Moreland who actually invented the thing. We never followed through with mass producing them, but it's basically 4 bungee cords that he tied in a knot at the center, and then you could hook each end of the bungee cord onto the bell of the saxophone, north, south, east, west, and put a microphone in the knot at the center, and it would actually suspend a microphone in the bell of the tuba.
Like perfectly at the opening of the bell.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. Yeah. And those worked great. Yeah, every club in town eventually built one and had one in their box, so that when a tuba player would come through, you just hop the thing on. And they seem to have lost favor lately, but I have one that I made that I use in the studio, and that was part of the Rebirth tuba sound on Phil Frazier, who's one of the greatest tuba players of all time. I can't stress enough how valuable the musicians are in the process of making great recordings. So starting with the mic down inside the throat, then you do the one suspended on we call it the tuba loom.
Nice.
You suspend it on the tuba loom, and then if you have isolation in the room, you can put a microphone a few feet out from the bell to kind of catch that shout voice.
From outside, the bell's pointing at the mic, or you're sort of in front of the tuba player. So there's nothing coming from the valves area or all those bends of tubing and all that?
No, nothing useful. The mouthpiece just sounds like farts, and the keys just click. So they're not helping you in any, you know what I mean? They aren't valuable sounds as compared to a saxophone where there's a sound coming out of those keys.
Right, because they open up right there.
Yeah, totally. And it's changing, the harmonics of it. And in fact, if you're going to record sax with only one microphone, try to make it an equilateral triangle between the microphone, the bell of the saxophone, and the keys of the saxophone. that seems to be the spot, like you were saying, the 12th fret on the guitar. That kind of equidistant spot between the bell, the keys, and the microphone on a saxophone is crazy, crazy useful for a solo saxophone.
Good tips, man. I probably needed to interview you before I went and recorded a whole bunch of saxophone. But these are great, man. I love this stuff. Now, how about the rest of a big band like the Rebirth Brass Band? I mean, what size studio, if you're going to have a big band in, how big of a space do you need? Where are you going to start thinking about these other mics?
So ideally, because it's performance oriented, it's not, a brass band is not something that's going to translate if you record each instrument one at a time. So you have to find a way to get the whole band performing at once. And in fact, historically the best brass band recordings have happened in a live concert that just happened to be captured in an interesting way. So the best brass band records, I think, come from this perspective of two or more microphones in the room, maybe in a stereo pair. It's kind of taking a picture like a master shot would on a camera, where you're kind of taking a picture of a whole entire band at once. And then if you put close mics in there, they're to reinforce it. Again, going from that idea of multiple perspectives, the way you would do a drum kit. I've got maybe a stereo pair out front in the room, but then I'm going to blend in the close kick drum mic until it sounds like I've tricked your ear into hearing a nice fat kick drum in a room. And so you want to do the same thing with the horns. Basically, for the Rebirth of New Orleans record, which won a Grammy, we recorded it. We were totally into doing orchestras and stuff for film scores, but we didn't get enough of that work. And one of the things that we were totally intrigued by doing film scoring work was the Decca-tree.
Right.
And so one of the things, Tracy Freeman worked on that record with me as well. He was a producer on that Rebirth record. And one of the things we discussed was, dude, what if we recorded this like you would an orchestra and a rock band at the same time? Because we were trying to figure out, where do you place somebody like the Rebirth Brass Band? They're half rock band, half orchestral, concert band. So we started with a Decca-tree in the room with the band all at once and got the sound that way. And then we decided there was too much drums and tuba bleeding in with the rest of the horn line. So we ended up moving the drums and tuba into an isolation room. So you have to have minimal, I would say, enough room to set the whole band up at once and step about 10 feet in front of them and put up two microphones. And that's where you start.
How many people in a band like that?
Minimum, you're going to have 6. You're going to have 3 on the back line, bass drum, snare drum, and tuba. And then on the front line, you're going to have minimum 1 sax, 1 trombone, and 1 trumpet. And then if it's a bigger band like Rebirth, they'll double up. They'll have 2 trombones, 2, sometimes 3 trumpets, and a saxophone with the bass drum, snare drum, and tuba as the back line.
Wow. And then what about some of the mic choices you might use for the different instruments in that big configuration? So
I can tell you for sure, if you've ever heard a recording that I had any say-so in, and there's a trombone involved, I'm either using a Coles 4038 or a RCA 44.
Okay, dig it. I feel like in some videos I saw you send me, maybe it was Naughty Professor with David Shaw. It looked like there were maybe some RCA 77s going 77. On. It wasn't a brass band, but
exactly. Yeah, that's more of a horn section. But yeah, the 77D is very close to a 44BX. It's important to note that a 77DX sounds completely different.
Okay.
The 77D sounds like a Coles 4038 or an RCA 44. That lazy, fat, dark ribbon sound. Whereas
the DX is a little more mid-rangey and a little more top.
Yeah, exactly. The DX, if you really want to put your finger on the DX sound, a lot of the early Louis Armstrong trumpet was a DX, and Sam Cooke.
For his vocals?
No, on the drums.
Oh, interesting. All right,
that
cool.
Recording of Summertime, the drum sound on that, in my mind, at least, I don't know how true it is. In my mind, I'm utterly convinced that is an RCA 77DX because that's exactly what that shit sounds like.
Okay, cool. And I know we've had success using that for distorted electric guitars in the past too, but we didn't put it right on an amp. We sort of like looked down at an amp and just got really cool sounds with it too.
Yeah, you kind of give it some space. You want to let the air do its job. Nothing mixes as well as air. So if you can get sounds to blend in the air, you're halfway there.
Yeah. All right. And then what about mics on stuff like the drums in the back line?
That stuff is actually really simple. The hardest part about somebody like Rebirth is each brass band is going to want a little bit different sound out of their bass drum. So like Rebirth wants to sound more like a marching band on the street. So I think that's a 414 on one side and an SM57 on the beater side. So that I could just kind of control the articulation of the beater. He's playing it by hand with a mallet. Mm-hmm. And so on the 414 side, I wanted to get more of that head and shell vibe. And on the 57 side, I wanted to get that mid-rangey attack that comes from the beater hitting the head. And it's a blend of those two. As compared to somebody like the Soul Rebels brass band, they want to have more of a hip-hop sound. And so a Beta 52 right up against the bass drum still isn't going to give you enough low end to make them happy.
Right.
So you really have to follow what the musician wants.
So how do you get a more low end out of it if it's not giving you enough right off the bat?
Yeah, you kind of have to. That's where, guys like Guy Charbonneau's words resonate in my head. If you do not turn a knob, why are you an engineer? It's like,
there you go.
Crank that EQ, buddy.
Dig it. And then you've got a snare too. Is that just an SM57?
Usually a SM57, and I'm going to shoot myself in the foot and make these things more valuable than they need to be. But the Western Electric or Altec 633A, commonly called the Salt Shaker, is one of the sickest snare drum microphones in the history of the world.
And that's a tube mic, isn't it?
No, it's a dynamic mic, and it's Omni. It's a real weird, like early 60s, like 1962, 63. It was basically the SM57 of 1962. And there's pictures of John F. Kennedy talking into him and Haile Selassie, and it's just like that era. And it's a dynamic microphone. It was made by Altec and Western Electric here in the States, and they used to cost $100. You could find them on eBay, and they call them a salt shaker because they actually look like a little salt shaker with holes in the top. They're made of steel, or like they're iron or something. There's some kind of really heavy, significant metal, so that if the snare drummer accidentally hits it, which happens in a brass band, you're not crying because you just destroyed your microphone.
Right, totally.
And the sound of it, it's the most open and bright sounding dynamic microphone I've ever heard. I bought numerous ones. I think I own 3 of them just because I never want them to go away. And there was
that's cool.
You could find them on eBay for a couple $100, and then word got out about them. Somebody wrote about them in Tape Op or something like that, and then all of a sudden, you've got $500 ones on eBay. And I was like, man, screw this. I don't. So I did some more research, and I found out that Northern Electric was Western Electric in Canada, and it's the same exact microphone. But everybody goes onto the eBay and searches Western Electric or Altec 633. Nobody searches Northern Electric 633. So there's my secret to those gearhounds out there. Go search Northern Electric instead of Western Electric whenever you want some old Westrex or Western Electric or Altec piece of gear. It was also made in Canada as Northern Electric.
Honestly, we love that stuff, man. We love that. We love that when there was no internet, and we still love that, hearing these like secret old school vintage tools that you can go searching for.
Yeah, that's totally it, man. And they're totally useful because they're still affordable. A couple $100 is not going to break the bank of anybody's recording budget. And it's a super useful and versatile tool. The thing that encourages experiment. Try it on different stuff. I know it works great on snare, and I kind of don't experiment with it too much after that. But I've used them as room mics. I've used them as, you ever do the build your own PZM where you take a microphone and you put it on a stand and you point it as close to the floor without touching as you can get, or close to a wall?
Not recently enough. So describe that trick some more.
So basically a PZM microphone, pressure zone microphone, is a microphone that the diaphragm is parallel to a flat surface, like a piece of metal or think of a card, basically like a postcard with a microphone on it that's pointing at the card, but there's a tiny little gap in between the microphone and the card, whatever it's made out of, metal or whatever. And it ends up being what they call the boundary effect. And they're sometimes called a boundary microphone. You see them a lot in conference rooms where they put them on conference tables because in essence, it turns the entire surface of the conference table into a microphone.
Right.
Because that diaphragm is pointing directly at the starter surface, whether it's a card or the conference table or a wall or whatever. Basically, any sound that hits that entire surface is going to find its way to the diaphragm of that microphone. And so if you take a 57, for example, and you say you're looking for an interesting room sound for your drums, provided there's a little bit of energy floating around in the room to begin with, some hard walls or whatever, you can take your 57 and just like you were miking the wall, as if it was a guitar speaker, you're going to mic the wall. And move the microphone closer and closer and closer to the wall. To be clear, the microphone is perpendicular to the wall. And move it closer and closer until you have like maybe a 1/4 inch gap or even an 1/8 inch gap. And go listen to that. And try compressing the hell out of it. That sound will scare the pants off of you sometimes.
That's awesome. I got to try that. I haven't, I've tend to put room mics up for the drums, ambient mics, and they're kind of near the wall, but I forget to try something as bold as just put it right up and point it at the wall and let the wall be what picks up that whole drum kit.
Totally. Or the back of a gobo, like a lot of studios will have a gobo or go-between that has absorbent on one side and hard on the other side so that you can kind of control an ambience. I find like if you got a drum kit and you put some gobos up around it, and the back surfaces away from the drum kit are hard surfaces, go ahead and put a microphone on those and see what happens.
And it's just a reminder, rock stars, to take time out, have a drum kit out there in your studio, have a friend who can, or an assistant or somebody who can grab a mic and just turn it up in the control room, and not during a session when you're pressed for time. Just have somebody move around the room and try the mic in all kinds of different locations, just so that you can have that experience of hearing all these unexpected sounds that exist in your studio space that you didn't even know were there, Totally.
It's accidents provide some of the sweetest inventions that you never would have found that in a million years, but because you accidentally you were working quick and you're trying to keep up with the band and you patched something wrong and you pulled it up and you went, holy cow, that's cool. You kind of file that away and you either make it work or finish it. I remember Daniel Lanois saying something along the lines of like, a brilliant record is not you go record and then sit down and say, okay, I'm going to put on my genius hat and do all my genius shit right now. It doesn't work like that. A brilliant record is genius moments that you collected and preserved all the way from the beginning to the end.
Oh, that's great.
Right? I love that. I love that concept, this idea that they're always around you, and our job is really to kind of ferry them and shepherd them towards the end of the recording. I love that concept.
That's great. One other tip that comes to mind when you're going to do this, like if you have somebody and they're moving the mic around and you're listening, you end up with a recording, and that can be really exciting. But what's frustrating is you listen to the recording, you're like, crap, where was the mic right there where it sounded so amazing? So a couple of tricks that I try is to have the person with the mic just continually say into the mic where they are in that moment. So you keep getting checked in. Or another one is just simply turn a video camera on and have that in sync or something like that, where you can just watch it later and you can hear exactly what was going on.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Whatever you can do to preserve the cool ideas, whatever it takes.
Yeah. Cool, man. All right. Well, so let's talk about recording Dr. John, man. Tell us about that. He's an amazing performer. He's a legend. He still makes amazing stuff today,
Well, unfortunately, he just passed June 6th.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know that. I don't know. Wow.
Yeah, it's new information. It just came out, But no, he it's been a pretty heavy week as far as Mac, Dr. John. His real name was Malcolm Rebenak, and he was a musician who started out in the 50s. He played his first session for the legendary Cosmo Matassa's studio in 1955 when he was 15 years old. And he just died June 6th. He was, I think they said he was 77, 78 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, heavy dude, man. Like, it's one of those things, like, give yourself an afternoon to dig into his body of work and learn who he was, because there's nothing I could say that would really accurately capture it. He was not of this world. He was a spiritual voodoo man who practiced gree-gree, something as close as voodoo or hoodoo that you could imagine in this day and age. Definitely of a completely different world, kind of an anachronism in that sense. Like,
interesting.
You can't comprehend how something like him existed in a world like today. And he had just the most brilliant mind for taking apart words and putting them back together. He wrote, his musical chops. He had the most. That's the thing about New Orleans and the way we revere our musicians, is that, what car you drive or what status you have in every other community means nothing. And in New Orleans, you're ranked solely on your skill. You are judged strictly by how damn good you are on your instrument. And Dr. John was a guy who had the respect of every single musician, because his musicianship was just top shelf. He had this real unique way of talking, and like I said, he would mangle words a lot, and he had this great organ sound that he would play. He played keyboards because he was originally a guitar player, and he got in a bar fight, and the bar owner shot off his ring finger on his left hand. So he had to learn how to play piano because he couldn't play guitar anymore.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm telling you, this I can't even begin to scratch the surface. Like, this guy was truly something. If I hadn't known him and loved him and worked with him, I wouldn't believe such a person ever existed. It was just that kind of guy. And but he had this real unique organ tone that he would use on certain overdubs that we would do, and it's that sound on a B3 that's mainly percussion, the percussion switch, that kind of chok chok sound. Yeah. And then he'd pull the drawbars out to where the only harmonics that were playing were a really low note and a really high note, so like a bass and a flute at the same time, kind of. And it made this real kind of flute sound when it was combined with the percussion. And he had a real specific kind of trill that he would play using that sound. And he did it one time. I was making a record. For backstory, I worked with him from 2002 until regularly 2014. And then after 2014, he kind of went through some changes that he wasn't making records as much anymore. And then it slowly deteriorated into he stopped touring, and he kind of would chill out at home. And Shane Terrio actually went to his house and put together enough music to make one more record on him. And that's going to be coming out at some point. But
wow.
But yeah, so I worked with Mac from 2002 until about 2014. And we were doing an overdub on something, and he pulled that sound out, and he played his lick, that, and it was like, whoa, I realized I've been hearing that sound my entire life. And in the moment, I thought, okay, part of this is growing up in New Orleans and literally hearing Dr. John my whole entire life. Mm-hmm. But I felt like it was something bigger than that. So I said something. I said, Mac, man, I've heard that sound forever. Everybody ripping you off. He goes, yeah, where you heard that sound before? I said, I don't know. I've heard it on Mockingbird by Carly Simon and James Taylor. At the end, in the ride out, there's that organ lick that happens throughout that whole thing. I said, that's exactly that sound you're playing. He goes, that's me. I was like, holy crap. And then there was another time where he pulled it out and he said, yeah, this is the way I used it on Spanish Harlem. And I know Tom Dowd's recordings inside and out. And I was like, Mac, I don't know. And Mac recorded with Tom Dowd. I got a lot of information about Tom Dowd from Mac directly. And I said, Mac, the Drifters Spanish Harlem doesn't have any organ on it at all. I know that recording really. No, asshole. I'm talking about Aretha's Spanish Harlem. And I was like, holy shit, he's right. That's a key component of that song on Aretha Franklin's version of Spanish Harlem, Dr. John's organ part. And so once you hear that part, you realize how ubiquitous he was. He was I mean, legit a member of the Wrecking Crew with Carol Kay and Hal Blaine and Earl Palmer, who was from New Orleans. Earl Palmer was one of the people who got Dr. John into the LA recording scene in the 60s. And just a heavy cat, man. I'll leave that for all your listeners to unpack.
That's so great, man. What a bunch of great stories. I'll have to go dig up some of those recordings too. Maybe I can find some of those on YouTube as well.
Oh, definitely. They're all, like I said, he was ubiquitous, man. He is everywhere.
Very, very cool, man. And it's this great reminder. The organ is such a wonderful instrument. I have a Hammond M101, I think it is, upstairs. And I don't have a B3, but it's pretty close. And it's got percussion. It's got the drawbars. And it's such an expressive instrument once you begin to explore, really messing with the sounds and the drawbars and coming up with different tones and, driving the Leslie and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's key and I think it can be, at one time I definitely believed it was the most expressive instrument that humans have come up with. And I still think obviously the voice is going to beat any instrument at any time, but the B3 is making a damn good run.
Yeah. Well, up here in Nashville, I like to say that the pedal steel is kind of like that for us. Yep. Have you had much chance to record that as well?
I really regrettably haven't. We've had a few guys who could do lap steel. There was a great guitar player who just passed a couple of years ago, a guy named Dave Rosser, who could play lap steel and just blow your mind. Another guy, unfortunately, who just passed, a guy named Spencer Boren, who could play lap steel and blow your mind. But as far as pedal steel, here's how weird it gets in New Orleans. There's a guy named Dave Easley, who is a absolute master pedal steel player. But when you listen to him play pedal steel, he's playing jazz. He's not playing country. He's not playing swing. He's not playing anything you've ever heard a pedal steel in context of before.
Very cool.
It's really sick. And at one time he was using a MIDI controller to convert his pedal steel notes into MIDI notes. It was crazy, but that's what pedal steel looks like in New Orleans. This is more of an anomaly.
Well, that's cool. Well, shout out to you, Jesse. That's my buddy who's in New Orleans now playing pedal steel. So he knows who he is. He knows who to go find. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you're ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I mastered my own record, Skadoosh, using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free course Mixmaster Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. And the best part is these techniques would work for you in whichever DAW you're using right now. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads for you to practice mixing and even include in your mixing portfolio if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to Mixmaster Bundle to get started for free now, or look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Talk about recording organ. What are some ways that you like to actually record organ? How would you have recorded Dr. John's organ?
So the first and foremost, because he is somebody specifically like Mac, like Dr. John, he is creating the sound he wants at the Leslie. He wasn't real stoked to use a B3 without a Leslie. And, for the listeners who aren't familiar, there's a whole nother story, the relationship between Mr. Hammond and Mr. Leslie. They did not get along.
Oh, interesting. I never heard that.
Yeah, two totally different companies. Basically, the purpose of the Hammond organ was to make the sound of a church organ and a portable device. And he just would play the sound out. It's basically additive synthesis. It's the most primitive additive synthesis you can think of. And he basically built this box that would play the sound out into a giant tube-driven speaker, and they hoped that they could recreate the sound of a pipe organ and replace all these pipe organs all over the place. And a lot of people felt like, the speaker, nice try, great job on the organ, but the speaker, not so much. So a few people tried different approaches on how to get the organ to sound more like a pipe organ. And this guy, I can't remember his first name Leslie, but Hammond's first name was like Beres Hammond or something like that. But this guy Leslie came up with this idea for a rotating speaker, and it's basically two speakers pointing away from each other in a box. One of them plays the low frequencies, it points down, and it has a spinning tub. And then the top speaker is pointing into a horn that's spinning around, and they spin in opposite directions, and you can control the speed or if they're spinning at all. And he sold it as an add-on in the 50s to the B3 organ, and Hammond, and everybody loved it. Everybody said, "Oh man, this is it." And people went to Hammond and said, "Dude, you should totally build a Leslie cabinet because this guy's going to steal all your business." And he was like, "No, it's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. It's designed to work through this speaker and blah, blah, blah. I hate that guy for building the Leslie." And the Leslie guy's like, "Fine, I'll just keep selling these things all day long." And that's what happened.
Free market, man. That's the way it drives innovation. That's
right. Let it fly. So, and
super cool.
So you didn't have a real set, starting in the late 50s, I guess the Jimmy Smiths and there's a million organ players whose names I can't remember right now who made that combination and decided this is the voice of the B3 organ. So what we know as the B3 is not a complete setup unless you have the organ and the Leslie working in concert. And I think that speaks to that expressiveness that you were talking about. It can really move you.
Now, how did you like to mic up a Leslie?
Yeah, sorry. So basically on the low tub, you'd put, I don't know, a D12, D112, just anything that captures good low end. You have to be mindful because those rotors are spinning and they will create wind noise. So you can end up with wind noise. But basically, if you just put a D112 or something like that at the bottom rotor, right where the amp is, there's a tube amp in the bottom of the Leslie. If you just kind of mic up that tube amp, you'll get all the low frequencies. And then on the top, you have to decide, do I want a mono signal or do I want a stereo signal? And if you want stereo, you can kind of put one microphone on either side of the spinning speaker at the top, like the bolts on the side of Frankenstein's head, one on either side. And you could do a Sennheiser 441 is great for that. Sennheiser 421 is great for that. What else? 57s work. SM81s, small diaphragm condensers, are a really great sound for jazz if you want to preserve that kind of open top end and make a real transparent sound. Things that don't work on the top end of the Leslie in stereo are large diaphragm microphones. A pair of U87s is not great on the top of a Leslie amp, but if you want to use, say you have to record a B3 and you only have a large diaphragm microphone, then what I would say is choose to record it in mono and back it off about 5 feet so that you're recording the entire Leslie speaker as one thing.
Yeah.
And just kind of get it in your head that you have two ways of recording organ, as a stereo thing or as a mono thing with one microphone. And I kind of simplify, you want to reduce the number of options. And that's just an easy way of reducing the options,
All right, cool. Now, and that's great, and thanks you for sharing that. How about when you would record piano for Dr. John? What were some ways that was this an upright piano? Was it a grand piano? What were some favorite ways to record? And were you recording his voice and the piano simultaneously? And is there anything we need to know about setting that up properly?
Okay, so to record Mac on piano, it was a kind of this weird anomaly that he would. It was like an old school mindset where when we did demos, he didn't care what he was recording on. But when he was doing the album, he would kind of gravitate towards a grand piano. Nothing like a 9-foot Steinway, but, at least a 5-foot Yamaha or something like that. And to get those mic'd up correctly, you want to be a couple inches off the strings or that more classical or jazz sound. You want to be outside of the harp altogether. You want to be outside of the instrument instead of shoving microphones into the soundboard. And so if he's singing at the same time, you were kind of screwed. And it's really difficult to separate the singing from the piano and vice versa. And so, I did a lot of stuff where I would convince it, you stuff blankets in behind the music rack, or, you do what you can to get isolation from the vocal as best you can. And then, you have that conversation with him and you say, look, it's bleeding. And he was such an old pro. He'd literally spent 50 years in the recording studio. So I could say, hey, your vocal's bleeding. And he'd say, okay, I'm going to reduce it to every first word or something like that. And that way the band still had a cue and he could keep his place by singing the right lyric, but it wasn't involved in the microphones as heavily as it would be if he was singing it like a performance.
Interesting.
That's his native thing. So there were times where I could get him to sing a little quieter. There were times where I could get him to, just isolate it enough. And then there were other times when I would investigate and find out that he was going to want to overdub a clavinet, or we use this RMI electric piano. That's kind of his classic right place sound. And so I discovered that, and he had this Nord that he loved inexplicably. And so it's like, you're one of the greatest piano players that's ever lived, and he loved his Nord, but whatever.
That's great.
And so what I discovered is that I could get him to do a first pass, a scratch pass with the band on the Nord, and then it was not an issue. And then we'd go back and overdub the piano as a second thing. So it was kind of any one of those techniques you had to be able to pull out at any time, depending on his mood or how quickly he wanted to work or the requirements of that moment. But sometimes there's no easy answer to how do you isolate the vocal from the piano.
Well, and you point out a good trick. You're a reminder of a trick. So whether it's voice and acoustic, voice and piano, voice and percussion, voice and whatever, you can actually start. Sometimes you could start by having somebody actually play and sing and like give it all they got, and then just go and overdub piano on top of that by just turning that way down as a guide track and overdub piano on top of that, and then overdub voice, and you can kind of rebuild it that way, and it can work pretty well.
Yeah, and I've done stuff where you had to patch in. It was an interesting thing. Like in 2002, I did the first session that Dr. John ever did on Pro Tools. He had always worked on tape before that. Nice. And so when he saw what I could do with Pro Tools, and he saw, like, he'd seen me cut tape, so he knew how quick I could make an edit on tape. But when he saw how quickly I could do that same edit or even a more complicated edit on Pro Tools, he almost immediately abandoned tape because he saw how quickly and easily you could edit. So he was always thinking in terms of a production as well. So, like, for example, he would play a part and make a mistake, and he'd come in on the talkback and say, hey, Chris, do I have to play that again, or can I use the tricknology? Which is what he would call Pro Tools, tricknology. So he definitely was somebody who was willing to grab any tool he could for the finish of the record. And if it was just punching in the piano where you could hear his bleed, he'd be game. So he wasn't opposed to any idea to go back and fix something.
Now, what about a vocal mic for Dr. John?
U87, U67. U67 would be the easy answer, but until this new reissue, I never in 30 years have heard two U67s that sounded remotely close to each other. So there's a place here in town, Esplanade Studio. It's an old church. This guy, Misha Kashkavili, runs it. Dude's a brilliant genius. And he's got a U67 that used to record Dr. John perfectly. But the U67 that I use out at Studio in the Country, didn't really work.
All right, cool. Well, so let me jump forward because there's just so much cool stuff to talk about. You've recorded B.B. King and the Meters. Tell us the story about working with those guys.
So the Meters they're the legendary studio band. The closest equivalent, I guess, would be Booker T and the MGs out of Memphis. Alan Toussaint was the preeminent singer, songwriter, piano player, producer from New Orleans. I mean, really created the sound of the 70s nationally as well as locally. Probably his biggest hit would be Lady Marmalade by Patti LaBelle. He wrote that and produced it. And the backing band on it, I think the drummer's different, but basically on all his recordings, he would use the same backing band. Zig Modalest, Art Neville on B3, George Porter Jr. on bass, and Zig Modalest on drums, and Leo Nocentelli on guitar. And that was his studio band, and he could shape that band into backing any artist that he was producing. And eventually the Meters were formed out of those four guys in the backing band, starting their own band and basically just saying we can do this on our own, or we should be a brand in and of ourselves. And they went on to be one of the most important bands in funk history, really kind of created that sound. And through the 90s and 2000s, they were tied up in a whole bunch of legal battles that made it really difficult. I don't think they were mad at each other. Like, I don't think they ever fell out of love with each other. I think their business just got so screwed up, which is also one of the problems in that era of New Orleans from the 50s and 60s and 70s, is that business kind of got sideways in the music business. And so guys like that would often get marginalized, and you'd have this ridiculous talent that was completely being underrepresented legally and financially, and they were just really being taken advantage of. And so a lot of times they would get caught up in deals that would prevent them from being able to do what they do best. And I think a lot of frustration grew out of that. So long story short, through the 90s and 2000, really through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, they had basically broken up and were kind of unable to play with each other. Two guys moved to San Francisco. One guy moved to LA, one guy moved to San Francisco. George and Art stayed here in town. And it just made it really difficult to have this legendary band. And then it coincided with the rise of the internet and how quickly you could share information. And all of a sudden, everybody wants more meters and more meters. And there was no meters to be had, even though all four dudes were still viable musicians at the top of their game. Just a really frustrating time. And so in 2006, 2007, in that aftermath of Katrina, there was a lot of recordings, a lot of attention. We had a big spotlight on New Orleans. And so a lot of our legends were starting to be paraded out, and we were starting to be able to say, hey, look, we're still viable as a creative community. And, we just need this little help with the infrastructure and the business, and we'll be back on our feet. And so there was a real push to get them to reunite. And so I was lucky enough to be the one who recorded it when it happened.
That's so cool, man.
And nobody's ever really heard that recording. The stuff that you've heard more of is now they ended up, a few years after that, they backed Trombone Shorty on one of his recordings, and that's all four original meters. And so the historicness of recording all four meters at once was kind of lost after they were able to start working together again. But don't get it twisted. That was pretty amazing to get 4 meters under the recording at once,
What was some of the things that went through your mind as far as how should I record these guys?
I wanted to do duty to the, like the first guy who taught me was Cosmo Matassa, and he was the guy who recorded them. And I wanted to do the duty to uphold my piece in the lineage. It's like the generation that inherits the farm. You don't want it to go bust on your watch.
Right.
My grandfather had this farm. I have to keep it running. I felt that way about the New Orleans, the responsibility I had to the New Orleans musicians, and the fact that I grew up here and I learned from the old school guys, in that direct lineage.
Yeah. You weren't like, hey guys, I got this great idea. We're going to do this all on iOS. I've got a great app on my iPhone.
As much as I would have liked to, no, you have to pick your battles. And I was just kind of happy to be in the room at that point.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us some of the miking that you would have used for the meters. I mean, we're talking about drums, organ, guitar, and bass, right?
So yeah. And then sometimes they'd play piano. There was singing as well. But for the guitar, let's see. One of the fun things that I thought ended up sounding great was doing a microphone on the front and back of the guitar amp. So like 2 SM7s, one on the front of the amp, one on the back of the amp, and flip the one on the back out of phase, and then just blend those two sounds. That was a really crazy, useful sound that I didn't expect was going to work as well as it did, but that came from the history of it. And then the other thing to remember is, like, back in the day, one of the things Kaz used to say was that, in the 50s and 60s, they didn't have a lot of microphones. There were just not a lot to be had. And so regardless of if he could afford them or if they were available in New Orleans, there just weren't a lot of microphones on planet Earth, period. And so by necessity, you had to learn how to record with less. And so that's where things like the 3 mic technique come out of, or kick and overhead for the entire drum sound, or things like you got 4 microphones to mic up the kit, you blend them down on a tube mixer to a mono channel, And that's your whole drum sound, is that mono channel. You've committed.
That's great.
You know, so things like that. But at the same time, taking advantage of modern conveniences, like the fact that I can put up 100 tracks in Pro Tools and record a safety of every single drum in case my 3-mic technique doesn't work or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, guys, those old legendary guys, the Fats Dominoes, the Alan Toussaints, the Dr. Johns, the Meters, they came from a time when you didn't have a ton of microphones to play with. So their sound doesn't really work if you put a ton of microphones on them. So you kind of have to use the more classic mic techniques because that's where they sound best. That's how they're playing. They're going to adjust their sound to sound like whatever you give them. And so keeping it simple definitely goes a long way with guys like that.
So are we talking like U67s and that kind of thing for the drums for overhead?
Let's see, overhead on, I think I used a Coles in mono out front on the drums, and 421 in the kick drum, 57 and a 451 taped together for the snare. Something ridiculous for the hi-hat mic because I wanted a ratty, trashy hi-hat sound. It was like a TAC microphone that came with a tape recorder or something like
nice.
that. And then the overheads were 414s. When in doubt, 414s will get you out of a lot of trouble.
Okay, so you did go stereo overheads.
Yeah. And even if you dump one of them and you just deliver a mono mix out of it, you know, sometimes printing it and deciding later is useful. But again, you don't want to give yourself too many choices.
Yeah. Now, old school 414s or the newer ones? No,
unfortunately, I got to say there's a difference between the ones with the physical switches and the LED switches. We used to call them the 414 and the Robot 414.
Right.
And unfortunately, man, I can't get behind the Robot 414s as ubiquitous as they are, as accessible as they are. I can't get behind them. Now, that said, the C214, which is basically like the 414 diaphragm with no switches, that's a great microphone.
That's one of the newer ones.
Yeah, it's like 5 years old. In the last 5 years they came out with it. I think it's a 214. That's a fantastic microphone. But
cool.
Short of that, unfortunately, yeah, I got to say 414, what is it? BULS?
Yeah, those that's what I've got. It's a darker 414 and I think and sort of has a silver face and a black face, I think, right?
Yeah, the holy grail is the 414 EB because that was the CK12 capsule that was in a C12 and a lot of heavy, large diaphragm microphones like that.
Okay, cool. Well, we're running out of time, but before we close up, let me ask you to share the story about working with B.B. King too, because that's another legend.
Yeah, that was a pretty heavy one. So I'll try to tell it quickly. We were doing a tribute to Fats Domino to help rebuild his house after Katrina, and B.B. King agreed to sing and play guitar on a song, and the backing band was Ivan Neville and Dumpster Funk, which is an amazing, soon-to-be legendary band in their own right. So we did the bed track here in New Orleans, and then I flew out to Vegas to record B.B. King doing his vocal and guitar. And so they bring in his guitar, and I take it out of the case, and I'm looking at it. It's like, holy cow, this is actually Lucille. So I pull it out, I plug it in. They had provided me a twin, and I think I just had a 57 on the twin. And I plugged it in and tried to get a sound out of it, and there's switches and knobs all over this thing. I'm thinking, you know what? Lucille's complicated like most women. I'm just going to plug this in and let B.B. King figure it out. I got the B.B. King himself coming in a minute, so I'll just put this on the stand. And to describe the sound that I was getting out of Lucille was like when a guitar cable has an open leg, like the signal is there. It's just real weak, and it's like an amp that won't go into distortion and is dark. It sounds like an impedance mismatch, really.
Right.
And so that's the best sound I could get out of it. So I figured, you know what, I'll just let him do his thing. So he comes in, and we record the vocal. I think we were at the Palms, whatever the studio in the hotel was, and I had a Telefunken 251 for his vocal. He sang it down. Pretty much the first take was exactly what I used all the way through. And we did another take, and I think in the end, the comp, I used mostly the first vocal take. And then on the second pass was the guitar, and he does his first pass of the guitar track, and it's amazing licks, just mind-blowingly good licks. Classic B.B. King, but the sound is terrible. It's the sound that I had left in there. He didn't change a thing about the sound.
Oh, no.
So I was like, oh, crap, what am I going to do? So he calls me in. He says, oh, young man, can you come in here for a second? I said, yes, sir, no problem. So I turned the playbacks down on the console and left Pro Tools running. So I actually have this conversation recorded still to this day. But he says, I think Lucille's not feeling too well. I said, oh, no, what's up? I come out in the room, and he asked me, do you have the microphone turned down? I said, yes, sir, I do. Because there were people in the control room, and he didn't want to hear. He says, look, I figured out the problem. Lucille likes it in this hole. And he unplugs, there were 2 jacks on the back of the guitar, and he unplugs it from the jack I had randomly picked and plugs it into the jack on the back of the guitar. And all of a sudden, there's Lucille and the sound of B.B. King. And so I was like, well, I am so sorry, Lucille. I apologize, So he says, all right, let's do another pass. I say, okay, no problem. So I run back into the control room, re-cue it up, and record. And this time, the sound is blistering. It's amazing. It's everything you've ever dreamt B.B. King was going to be. But the performance, you could kind of tell he had given me his best shot on that first take. So he comes in, he finishes up, and he says, what do you think? I said, okay, I think I got enough. I can comp it together. And at this point, I was basically lying. And so he says, okay, and he comes back in because I was just so nervous about screwing it up, about pissing him off. It's just so many things going through my head. I said, let me comp something together, and if I have to take another take, we'll go back and record some more. He says, okay, no problem. So he comes in, he's talking to the hangers-on in the studio, and I'm comping my ass off. Like, just, I decide, you know what? Screw the sound. The whole thing, all that matters is I have to get the performance right. If this performance isn't right, nobody's going to care if it's B.B. King. So I decide, regardless of how it sounds, I'm just going to put his hottest licks as the guitar part. So just as I'm finishing the comp, he's looking up on okay, you ready to play it for me, young man? It's like, yep, I guess I am. Whether I'm, at this point, the comp is, I would say, 80% first take and shit sound. And about 20% of it is the killer sound, but the second take. So I'm sweating at this point, like, oh crap, he wants to hear it. I've not listened to it all the way through. I have no idea. If I hit play, if I smash the space bar right now, all the confidence in me in this room is going to go out. And you're dead as soon as the band loses their confidence in you. So right. You got to keep your confidence. You got to keep their confidence in you. So I realized, shit, I got to do something. And this was kind of, it was early in the days of HD Pro Tools. So not a lot of people had a ton of plugins. But I thought, you know what, maybe if I can blast this whole thing through a distortion plugin, you won't notice the change in sound too much. So just before I hit play, I switch over to the mixer screen, I pull in the plugin list, and I look, and there's no real distortion plugins. It's just like the stock plugins from Pro Tools. And I look, and there's SansAmp. And I was like, oh, okay, SansAmp. Maybe there's a twin, and I can at least match the guitar amp setting that I had on the twin. So I pull up the SansAmp plugin, and this is all happening in seconds, mind you. He's just asked me to play this back, and I'm panicking.
Right.
So I pull up the SansAmp. I'm looking through the preset list on the SansAmp because, a SansAmp setting is like crunch, punch, low, high. It makes no sense in the real world.
Yeah.
A preset's going to give me the best fighting chance. So I pull up the preset. I'm looking for a twin. Oh, there's a preset called B.B. King. Let me use that. Click, play, boom. That's pretty much how you hear it on the record.
That's so awesome, dude. What an amazing story. Holy crap. That was great, dude. Thank you for sharing that, man. That's good. That's legendary story on the podcast right now. Oh, awesome. Well, man, I don't even want to go, but let me jump to a couple of our closing questions.
Sure.
And before I thank you profusely for being on the podcast with us. But when you started out in recording, what do you feel like was holding you back?
just not having enough time. So back then there was no Pro Tools, there was no computers in a studio at all unless you were doing MIDI. And you had to get actual hours putting microphones on shit. You had to get actual hours learning how a Neve works, learning how an SSL works, learning how a Trident works. Whatever studios had in those days, you had to learn it. And so the only way you were really going to get good was doing it over and over again, talking to your friends and stuff like that. So that sense of community was there because I had a few friends who were doing it, and we were lucky enough to have a bunch of decent studios in town at the time I started. But in those days, the hardest thing to get was time in the studio. So you would do sessions and hang later so that you could do your own shit after the band left or whatever. And I think that's ultimately how like Trent Reznor made Pretty Hate Machine, is he assisted at a studio until he could get time at midnight, you know,
That's right.
So I would say, just to put it in comparison to what you're up against today, if the hardest thing for me to get started with was getting time on the equipment, you could almost say there's no excuse if somebody's got a decent rig in their house or a laptop and a pair of speakers. But even then, it comes down to the time that you put into it. You know, you have to just put the hours in and make those mistakes. Don't be afraid to paint in broad strokes and then force yourself to clean up your mess later, because that gives you some skills. But the fact is, you're not going to get any skills if you just read about it or listen to a podcast. And I'm a huge fan. I'm a rock star, a recording studio rock star fan. I still am pounding information into my head however I can get it. I'm going to be learning this stuff until the day I die. And
that's great.
You know, that's the thing you got to remember. Put the time in.
And you know, put the time in, but give yourself a little bit of pressure too, because I think sometimes people suffer from like, I'll just keep tweaking and I'm not really moving forward. You know, if you didn't have B.B. King looking over your shoulder, you might not have just looked for the preset and gone for it to discover what sounded good. You might still be tweaking that guitar solo to this day.
Exactly. That's totally it. Given, you know, sometimes reducing your options is never a bad thing. So, you know, reduce your options, even if it makes you panic, because that might give you some, you know, fight or flight instinct that you rely on for the rest of your career.
So I think I was just cracking up so much at your story. I forgot to listen to what B.B. King's reaction was when he heard the solo go by.
Oh, he was like, "Oh, that's very good. You did a great job with that, young man." And he was done. He was stoked that he didn't have to go do another pass.
That's so funny. So you made the right move. You didn't make him keep playing. Yep. That's great, man. All right. Well, so now this last question is hypothetical, but we're going to take the Wayback Studio machine.
Okay.
And you're going to go back in time, find young Chris, want to be an astronaut. And you're going to say, listen, dude, here's the single most important thing you need to know to actually be a rock star of the recording studio yourself one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
Damn, that's a good one. Somewhere between trust yourself and listen above everything. Listen 3 times before you speak. Listen 3 times before you think. Listen 3 times before you move a microphone. Listen 3 times before you act. Listening becomes the most important thing you can do. And I don't just mean listening like, what is this going to sound like to the microphone? I mean listening when a singer comes in and says, "Oh, I'm not going to sing very good today." What are they telling you? You know, I would say listening with your third ear, to borrow from Ryan Hewitt. You know, like that, this idea of listening beyond the sound and hearing the emotional standpoint of it, and then trusting yourself to know that you have the tools, however meager. You may feel like, "Oh, I know so little about recording." Screw that. You know enough. However much you know about recording, you know enough to get started. You can always learn more. I still want to learn more. Andrew Shepp's told me many times he wants to learn more. So it doesn't matter where you are in the game, you always can learn more. So get that out of the way and just assume you're going to be learning until the day you croak. So between now and then, go ahead and make some mistakes, make some, you know, do some experiments, try some stuff, fail. You know, trust that you have enough to get out there on the road and start driving.
So great, man. I love that advice. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. You have been an awesome guest.
Man,
I'm astounded with all these great tips and stories you've shared. I've learned a ton so far. Let the rock stars know how they can find you online. How can they learn more about you? I guess we didn't really get to talk much about 30 amp, but let us know how we can find that too and keep up with your next adventure to go record people around the world.
For sure. Yeah. So, I kind of have the personal social media stuff going. My Twitter is at Augustus at Sea, all one word, SEA, like on a boat. And it's just kind of my own brain droppings that come out of that. And then Facebook, I'm generally inclined to friend people on Facebook if I've met you in person or spoken to you on the phone. So don't be afraid to reach out and start a dialogue. And let's be friends on Facebook that way. I don't just accept every friend there, but it's pretty obvious if you search Chris Finney on Facebook which one is me. And let's see, where else? The Trombone Shorty Academy or Trombone Shorty Foundation. Their website, tromboneshortyfoundation.org, is a great place to keep up with me and what I'm doing with my students. And then 30ampcircuit.com and .org is the record label with me and Charlie as we go all over the world. Unfortunately, not moving as quickly as we'd like it to with the current administration and their opinions about how people from Mexico should be able to come into America. But we're forging on anyway. We're still living the dream and dreaming the dream. So that's what's up.
Very cool, man. Well, dude, thank you so much for being on the show with us. It's been an absolute pleasure hanging out with you. And I'm going to make sure that our mutual friend, Pat Sansone, that I pass on the hello. He'll probably be listening to this right now. Hey, Pat. And you too, John Stewart. I'm guessing maybe you know John as well. I've known
John a long time. I sure have, man. It's some fun people right there.
So cool, man. Well, thanks, dude. And I look forward to meeting you in person, too.
Likewise, bro. I've had a blast. Keep up the great work. I'm really proud of what y'all are doing, and I consider this a huge resource. I can't say enough. Anything you absolutely ever need from me, I am at your service. The same goes for you, rock stars. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Chris. Cheers.
You got it.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.